Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael S. Seaver. You're listening to Equal Chance to be Unequal, my podcast about unlocking human potential through helping people disconnected from their purpose uncover and live their purpose.
I have a great deal of pleasure right now. One of the big things that I know that I'm able to bring are different people that I get connected with here and there. Our next speaker specializes in the derivatives and the cost of capital, and it's not going to be much fun for you today at all. I did a survey and I said to you folks, what are you interested in? What sorts of things do you want to get out of marketing? There were several of you that said personal branding, and today we're going to talk about regular sort of corporate branding sort of issues, but personal branding isn't really my forte, but it is the forte of the next speaker, Michael Seaver. Michael has worked with a number of executives, and he works very closely with a very good friend of mine who's CFO with a large company here in the Valley, and works with them on different sort of corporate coaching issues. But I'm going to keep my introduction brief and turn it over to you, Michael, to talk a little bit about yourself. But please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Doug. And so I don't understand derivatives very well. And Christine's like, that's a very good thing. Thank you for not speaking about that. I happen to deal with people who are in very, very significant situations of change. So I have clients that are addicted to cocaine, right? But they're senior executives within organizations, and they're trying to figure out a way how to overcome cocaine or figure out how to maintain their life. I have clients who are having very, very significant like spousal relationship issues. I have clients whose children are being sent off to other states to wilderness camps because they're really significantly struggling with something. They don't fit into society as it stands. So it's my job to help them through a process. And oftentimes, right, that process begins with personal branding or executive branding. So back in 2013, I had trademarked what I call the Incorporate You process, which is basically taking business strategy concepts and applying it to human development, right? So my belief is that every person in this room is the CEO of their own name.com or their own company, Inc., whatever that might be. So I just figured out a way to help people get that into their mind. You're learning a lot of great information about what it takes to run a business. Let's take those same methodologies and basically apply them to yourselves in your own development in some meaningful way. Anybody listen to podcasts? Okay, pretty fair amount of you. What about Finding Mastery by Michael Gervais? A couple of you? Okay, good, great. So Michael Gervais is a world-renowned executive, kind of human performance coach, works a lot with the Seattle Seahawks. Tremendous guy. The one that I just listened to on the way here was his interview of Bob Bowman, who is the swim coach here, basically. But he's also been the coach for 20 years of Michael Phelps, right? So very, very, very interesting dialogue. So if you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to download it and take a peek because it was really, really cool dialogue. One of the major things that I take away from that particular podcast, which is kind of the 5 things I'll talk about right now, is that we get so heavily focused in on some sort of a destination, someplace that we're attempting to go to, that oftentimes we forget about the journey or the process in order to make that destination or outcome occur. And we get so heavily focused in on the goal. Hey, by the time I finish my EMBA, these things are going to happen. And that's legit to some point, but what's more important are the daily habits and rituals that you utilize today and every day to potentially make that happen. So in my work as a coach, I get to work with folks from all over the nation, lots of different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different industries, different functions. But what matters more is whether or not day to day they're going to do the things that we've mutually agreed that they need to do. That's the thing that trumps everything else. And if you can stay committed to that, whatever that is, whether it's a mind, body, spirit thing, whether it's a wellness thing, whether it's staying committed to Doug's homework, right? You pick what it is. It's got to be something. And I can tell whether or not a person is going to be successful probably within the first hour of meeting him or her, whether or not they're willing to do some really, really basic small homework. Okay? So be thinking about that as you think about the development of your own brands or the things that you're attempting to create. So let me give you just a little bit of a spin on what you probably have talked about, the marketing mix in some way, or will. I'm going to try to put a little bit of a personal executive branding spin on that. So when I think about branding, so step number one, branding, what is branding when it comes to humans or executives? So in 2013, I trademarked this process that basically took together a couple of major things. Has anybody done a Myers-Briggs or a DISC or StrengthsFinder? Many of you have? Okay, great. So the very first step in my process is to take the DISC, to take what's called the 12 driving forces, which is what motivates a person. And then the third step is I ask them a series of questions. So through the DISC, through the motivators, and through these series of questions, I can basically assess a person's nature versus nurture, right? Where are they coming from? What's actually going on? What is that person's life's narrative? How did they get to where they are today? Because the story of how they got today is really critical in determining where they're going to go next. So what communication preferences, motivators, and their narrative. So I take those three things and I pull out themes of information. Typically, there's 6 to 8 themes that have run throughout the person's life in a very meaningful way. So how do we convert those themes into something that's saleable of you as a person? So we take the themes and we write a personal mission statement, we write 3-year goals, and we write an executive branding statement. The same way that probably Doug has talked about what are the branding statements and the value proposition statements and the unique selling propositions that exist of a company, I'm asking you to come up with that same information about yourself as a person. How many people in the room have done that? There's a couple of you that have. Okay, Alan's like, maybe a little bit. So for the rest of you who haven't, maybe look around the room at the folks that said that they have and consider it. The process that I utilize, I also have a podcast. It's called Equal Chance to Be Unequal. And you could just go to like Apple iTunes or you can go to Google Play Music and you can download it. But the 3rd episode of my podcast is basically my process. So if you're looking for some free basic information about what you can do, just listen to that podcast. It's probably an hour long. It might help you to understand what does this look like? How does Michael work through this in a meaningful way? So when it comes to branding, the goal is go through this assessment process, figure out this Q&A, get to the point of saying, here's the mission, here's the person's goals, here's the executive brand, right? Here's what makes them different or unique. So the second thing I like to think about is maybe what we've called services. How do we make sure that all of these things that are us, our strengths, our capabilities, what makes us different and unique, how do we make sure that they're actually valued by the community? So what are some ways that you guys have looked and said, how do I make sure that I'm valuable in the community? Are there specific ways that you've gone about that? Talk to a recruiter maybe? What else? Anything? Just speak up. Consultants. So talk to consultants. Good one. Talking to a mentor, like where can I plug in? How can my strengths connect with this business? Good one.
I was going to say if you have a family member that's in.
There you go. Right, informational interviews of family members could be a great one. Thanks, Rose.
Industry trend.
There you go. So where are the pieces of data that exist in the industry that can help us to say, okay, this is how much money this person makes, or there's an interesting position here. Here's my strengths. Here's how it aligns to this particular need. It's fantastic. Executive recruiters obviously are a very, very key place here to talk to, and there's a ton of them that exist out there the same way that there are tons of executive coaches, but find one that really matters a lot to you and get connected to that person and his or her data. Talking to family members, figuring out a way to look at LinkedIn. You guys spend a lot of time in LinkedIn-ish. I would encourage you to do that. Obviously, after Microsoft bought LinkedIn, they have a lot more data. They have a lot more interesting information on the inside. So sometimes if I'm helping a client to figure out aspirationally where they want to go, I'll go find 5 or 6 people in LinkedIn who have that potential title and look at the narrative of that person's life to say, here are the skill sets that this person has that my client should have. Where's the gap between where my client stands and where they're looking to go? So making sure that there's a lot of really significant industry information that's being gathered. I listen to a ton of podcasts, maybe you guys do too, a ton of TED Talks, a ton of YouTube videos, spend a lot of time having coffee with people just to understand like what's happening in the marketplace. Those things matter a lot. If you don't have any money separated out in your budget, I would consider it to be something that would be valuable. Say, how many times per week can you have coffee or can you have lunch or do something with somebody close to you that you can learn something new that maybe you hadn't considered before? That's a pretty interesting dialogue or something to consider. Another thing that I think is really important, number 3, is this idea of pricing, right? How do we make sure we know what our value is in the marketplace? What does that actually look like? Obviously, you can talk to those executive recruiters we just talked about a second ago. You can go to salary.com. You can go to payscale.com. You can go to Glassdoor. How many people here simply go on interviews just to know what's happening in the marketplace? A couple of you? Maybe this happens a lot with folks that I serve, right? Because when you get to a certain level inside society, there's just not a lot of availability of jobs. And you have to really consider that right now, unemployment in America is about 4.5%. It is very low. There are 155.2 million Americans working right now, which is nearly the highest ever. So the competition for your, for anything that you're thinking about doing is really high. It's very, very high. So to understand your value, you have to say, here's the 8, 9, 10 organizations that I really want to figure out how to play in. I'm going to go interview with them just to see what's there and available and figure out what I'm worth in their mind. I have a client who used to run a couple of small businesses locally. He was pursued by the Mayo Clinic to do some communications work with them, flew back to Rochester in Minnesota a number of times, and through about 35 interviews with Mayo, he came back and he's like, you know what, it's just not for me. There's a disconnect between their mission and my personal mission. So at the same time, he just happened to get a reach out from an organization locally that had a few $1 million in capital injected into it, and they said, we want you to be our CEO. He and I had this debate about what's the appropriate pay level, because you can make a heck of a lot more at Mayo, but what's the thing that really ignites your soul on fire in a meaningful way? And for him, it was the local startup in a lot of different ways. So be thinking about that. Be thinking about some alternative methods or paths by which you can assess what's your actual value in the marketplace. Because there are a lot of different ways to do that, from online sources all the way up to people that you meet with in person.
I was just going to ask, have you been able to do that without jeopardizing your current job or your current state? Because I'm always concerned that sometimes, if you go out and kind of just put your toe in the water, right, could that come back to bite you in some shape or form?
In certain cases, it can, if you have other people around you that are maybe just a little bit vindictive. Can it happen? Yes. Are people so darn busy with their own stuff that they're probably not going to mess with yours? Yes. So I'm just a bigger fan of doing that. And if you can keep it under the radar, use a sick day, use a PTO day, do something like that, do your best to make that happen. Because so many people go through life kind of just existing and not necessarily thinking what they're capable of. Doug and I were talking on the way over that change is really hard for people naturally, especially when it's bestowed upon us, as opposed to something we proactively choose to do. So be more proactive in going after whatever that change is that you desire. So that's just a really important thing to consider, is don't be too afraid of whatever is happening to go out there and try. I just think there's more value in proactively trying, in whatever way that means for you. I just think that people are so busy that they're not necessarily going to want to mess up too many things in your world. That's important. Good question. So the fourth thing I think about when I think about the marketing mix of executive branding is basically distribution. So where is it that people know about who you are? And some of us have resumes, some of us have LinkedIn profiles, some of us may even have our own website. Who has their own website, just their name.com? Doug does, that's awesome. Like seriously. This is something that maybe we can do as a takeaway from today's dialogue, is figure out a way to go to GoDaddy and just buy yourname.com. And so the basic thing is just route it straight to your LinkedIn profile. Don't make it hard, just route it to your LinkedIn profile. Very, very simple. It costs you $10 a year, but it's a very good thing to have that you can protect. And I do that quite a bit. So buy yourname.com. When I think about distribution channels, right, it's resumes, it's LinkedIn, it's cover letters, it's face-to-face meetings, it's all these things. But I want you to think about not only that, but also think about each of you probably has a full-time job, but I don't know if each of you has an additional part-time job. Part-time job could be a really interesting place to push your brand somewhere that it doesn't currently exist. How many people have a side business or something entrepreneurial happening? So a few of you. Incredible, incredible tool to understand yourself, but also to push your brand out into the world in a way that it might not yet. Think about what that side business might be. There's lots of great things, incubators, accelerators that exist inside ASU, but also externally, right? I've written content for SeedSpot and done a lot of work with CEI and some other incubators and accelerators locally. They're absolutely fantastic. So you can get something going on the side very quickly, very cheaply, very easily. But it's a good way to push your brand out into the community. I'm also a big fan of thinking about what professional associations you guys play in, right? So for your industry, for your function, what professional associations, engaging somehow with ASU's alumni association in a meaningful way, right? What about a faith-based or some sort of a religious institution that you believe in and care about? How can you go spend time there? So I want you to think about it in terms of your time. Okay, how many people serve on a board of a not-for-profit? Quite a few of you, okay? Another tremendous way to build your brand is to serve on a board or do something philanthropic with a not-for-profit. Right? So I'm a big fan of coaching and mentoring, obviously, so I serve on the board of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central Arizona. And it means a ton to me to do that because I know there's 1,500 kids out there that wouldn't normally have a big brother or a big sister, that they now have that as a result of some of the things that I can do to raise money and to help them and help people in the program, right, the people that work on the staff, to be better. So think about that as another distribution channel in some meaningful way. Then the last thing we want to think about is like, what are, number 5 for me in terms of the marketing matrix, is what are those communication channels that you use to push out information about yourself? If a lot of us don't have our own website, that's okay. But what are some other ways that you share info about yourself? Do you guys use email? Do you guys use LinkedIn, at least a fair amount? What else?
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
Good channels. Good. What else?
Networking events.
Face-to-face stuff, professional. Good. What else? And that's okay if that's it. Having a blog, right? Maybe the website, something along those lines. See, there's so many ways to push out your own thought leadership, things that you really care about. A blog is YouTube, right? There's a lot of stuff going on there. Did you guys see that thing in the news recently about YouTube? Apparently, if YouTube takes money away from one of its people who posts videos, the person goes in and shoots them up, which is not good. But like, what has our society become in the last, couple of years that all of a sudden we think that that's a viable option of how to get our money back? It's not going to work. Another interesting thing along those same lines, thank you for saying that. If you haven't read a book called The Pendulum, I would encourage you to look at it. Don't necessarily read the book, but maybe just look at a summary of it. It's about how humans, and we basically go in 40-year cycles of conflict. And basically the mix is that we go from a we culture and a we mindset to a me mindset. And so right at the middle of that pendulum is where we see an awful lot of conflict and bad stuff happening in society. And so that pendulum just happens to be at that point of conflict in 2020, according to this guy's theory. So 2020 might be the year that there's a lot of stuff happening, or there's a penultimate event of some sort that happens. So something to keep your eye on. But when it comes to those places of communication, how do we push out our content? Blogs, websites, social media, which we talked about. I mentioned earlier, podcasting is a great way. So if you guys wanted to think about starting a podcast, very, very simple, very low cost. But think about all of the things that are really unique and different about you and developing your executive brand. There's got to be a lot of places that you share it. I'm going to Dallas Monday to talk to a group of 800 CFOs basically about mentorship at its core. But one of the interesting data points that I'm going to use to kick off the dialogue is a guy named Michael Simmons had done some work and got it published in Forbes that showed that when a person is in what's referred to as an open network, he or she has a far greater capacity to advance in his or her career very rapidly than a person who's in a closed network. And by a closed network, I mean they basically hang out with the same 5 or 10 people every day. But when they're consciously creating opportunities each week to meet new people that they wouldn't have normally met, they actually advance in their career. And his statistics show that it attributed to more than 50% of that person's career growth. So when you think about you getting a pay raise or you finding a different job or you starting a business, it's not going to be because of your IQ or necessarily your EQ. What really is going to matter more than anything else is your capacity to meet new people. Like, we can try to make this difficult or hard, but we don't have to. Like, just literally find a way to meet 3 new people each week, and then you just have a little bit of time for reflection, bring a bunch of stuff together, and off you go. That's my quick look. I'm going to be respectful of Doug's time. That's my quick look, right? How do we make sure that we set our brand appropriately? How do we make sure that we look at distribution? How do we make sure that we look at communication? How do we make sure that we look at pricing? How do we make sure we look at those things in a meaningful way to push our brand out there? So discover it, understand it, and then find ways to share it meaningfully in a very, very meaningful way. I'll stop there because I'm respectful. Questions? Sure. So how to go into the open network?
Yes, like mechanisms as to how we should do that.
Sure. So if you're thinking about ways to, and just so you guys know, I'm actually a really significant introvert and I'm really task oriented. So these presentations are actually hard for me because I would love nothing more than to be sitting in my home computer, like typing an email. Like, that to me means the world. So for the introverts in the world that are like me, that the game is that pick a friend, pick a colleague that you trust, and try to go to different events. So whether it's an alumni association event, it's a professional association event, it's a religious or faith-based event, or if it's some other community thing that's happening, if you feel like you don't want to necessarily go, but you would like to learn more, pick somebody to go with, and then it's easier to have those conversations and dialogues. So if you know what your mission is, your life's mission, right, from step number 1, it becomes a lot simpler then to pick another professional association or alumni association or faith-based institution or similar that has a similar mission. Because my work is oftentimes tied to how to make sure that the person's personal mission is connected to the organization's mission, right? That's the power. So the start is pick a friend that you feel comfortable going with, find an organization that has a similar mission to what is in your heart, and then go spend time with them 2 to 3 times a week.
If you don't feel like you don't know what your personal brand should be because you want to do something unlike what you see around you, how long can you defer that?
You can defer it forever. So if you're thinking about, here's my most authentic self, right? Here I am at my most authentic being. The game is that you can never be that. You can never do that, right? My grandmother is 87. She's not well. I went back to Michigan to see her a couple weeks back. She just doesn't have a lot of time. So I started asking her a series of questions, and basically the vast majority of our 6-hour conversation was a litany of regrets. Just regrets. These are all the things that I wish I would have done. Now, granted, she's a millionaire. She's traveled the world. She's done cool things. But still, when we had this dialogue, she was concerned about regrets. So in order to overcome that or to not regret something when we're getting to a point later in life, you have to kind of challenge yourself to say, hey, listen to that first podcast 3 that I was talking about on mine. Walk through it and say, I think this is the mission. So then the best way to do it is that the reason why Weight Watchers or Alcoholics Anonymous or other groups like Lean In Group through Sheryl Sandberg, the reason why they're so powerful is that they bring social connectedness together. They allow for you to be with people who are going through a similar thing. So if you don't feel comfortable doing it on your own, find a group of people to do it with, have that confidence and empowerment, and then try to take small risks in whatever way that is for you. And through that, you build up an empowerment to be able to say, hey, I think it's okay for me to try this, whatever that is. And it's just that. Kotter's 8-step model of change talks about, I think it's step 6, that says that you have to create and manufacture small wins. Like anytime you're doing organizational change or human change, it's all about creating small wins and creating momentum. That's all it is. Does that make sense? Did that help?
Yeah.
So we just need to get to that point of wins.
Do you have different strategies for internal to your organization branding / networking as opposed to external, as in trying to navigate internally, especially if you work for a large organization?
Sure. So thank you, Alan. So the question for me is that should you have different strategies internally, externally? I believe that you should always come from a place of pure transparency about what you are. So defining the mission, here's the goal, here's daily process, here's the executive brand. Do you have to deliver that in different methods depending on the audience? Yes, you have to. Because it's always about tailoring who you are, what you are, to the person you're attempting to deliver it to. All humans come with a very, very, very significant set of judgments based on our childhood, based on the challenges we've had, based on all this stuff. So what is the thing about you that's core, it's not going to change, but is the thing that they can receive the fastest? To me, that's the game. So you're always going to have the thing that's true and authentic to you, but how do you deliver it to that audience in a way that's meaningful for them? Right, that's so critical in so many ways. So maybe that's something that Doug has talked about before, but it's so true for us as persons. Most of the time when I work with teams, the issue is almost always people that are butting heads. I get flown across the United States basically to make sure that people can communicate more effectively because they're bringing their own junk, their own judgments from home into the workplace. So I have to kind of shed all that bad stuff away and just get them to have a conversation or dialogue together. But it's about tailoring what you are to the audience in a meaningful way.
Do you have like a certain methodology for developing content for your personal brand? Because I feel like to stay relevant, you have to have constant content and new information, new topics. Do you do that yourself, or do you contract someone, or do you have a methodology?
Everybody's different in that way. I'm a big fan of, anybody know of Vayner Media, Gary Vaynerchuk? A couple of you guys? Okay, good. A really, really interesting guy to follow. He's based in New York City doing some really interesting things when it comes to branding. And so I just think he does it very, very well. He's got a great podcast, website's great, great newsletter that goes out. When I think about how do you create content, it's always about who is the intended audience, who is it that you're really kind of driving to, and saying, what is it that they want? How do they receive this? And that's the game, is that it's different for everybody, because sometimes a social media post that's a quote works really, really well. Sometimes pushing out an article works for a completely different audience. It's more about saying who is the intended audience and what are the ways, based on data, based on Google AdWords, based on whatever, to know what they're receiving. Sometimes it's social media, sometimes it's articles, sometimes it's e-newsletters, sometimes it's podcasts, sometimes it's face-to-face presentations like this. You just never know what can happen. There's a lot of ways, but it's making sure that you're delivering it to the audience in a way that they can receive it. But then when you think about that brand, once you've got it defined, I'm just a big fan of saying, when I'm helping people, here's my brand process, how can I give bits and pieces of information that constantly support that process and that thing? So it's about, here's the brand, here's the process in which I push it out and use it, and how can I chunk it out into small pieces and then distribute that meaningfully. I'm always trying to tailor the stuff that I do to specific events that are coming up. So there's an event June 7th, I have to give a keynote. So I'm making sure that from now all the way into that June 7th event, I'm pushing out content that gets people interested in going to it. It's just about setting those milestones and delivering it in a way that people can receive it. Hopefully. Hopefully. Other questions? I think I've taken up way too much of your time, I think. Good?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
It's not much, but on behalf of myself and the class, we'd like to give you a brown bag. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks so much, and I know if people have questions or whatever, they know how to get hold of you. And
Yeah, everybody received the PDF. I think that he uploaded to Blackboard. Okay.
Yeah.
So please, guys, just reach out, text me, call me. I get calls at 2 a.m. Call me at 2 a.m. Like, just anything, right? I just want to be able to help.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you all. Good afternoon. Thanks, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equal Chance to Be Unequal. I'm Michael S. Seaver. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and like, share, or comment on this podcast on michaelssseaver.com, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Go forth and be awesome.